My name is Myra Spencer. I'm 36, and I've stitched up strangers at 3 in the morning without my hands ever shaking. A year after my divorce, I was finishing a shift near the maternity ward when my ex-mother-in-law spotted me by the elevators. Carol Bishop had a way of smiling that looked like a door closing. She walked right up, smug as Sunday, and said it loud enough for the nurses to hear. "Leaving you was the best decision my son ever made. Now he has a baby boy, with your best friend." 6 years of being called the broken one, packed into a single breath. I didn't flinch. I just looked at her, calm as a flat line, and said, "Is that what you believe?" 5 minutes later, a man neither she nor my best friend expected walked through that door. And the one name nobody wanted written down was about to be read out loud in a courtroom. Welcome back to Calm Drama Stories, where calm women face loud cruelty, and the truth takes its time, but never misses. If a quiet kind of justice is your thing, settle in. Drop a comment telling me where you're listening from, and be sure to subscribe. Let me back up 5 minutes, because the smile came before the man did. It was a Thursday, near the end of a 12-hour shift, and I was handing off a chart to a night nurse named Theo. The maternity wing sat one hallway over from the emergency department where I worked, and I'd cut through it 100 times without thinking. Carol was there visiting. Of course she was. Paige had delivered 3 weeks earlier, and the whole Bishop side of town had been parading through with balloons and casseroles. I knew that. I'd braced for it. What I hadn't braced for was Carol planting herself in my path like she'd been waiting all afternoon. She looked me up and down, taking in my scrubs and my tired eyes, and her chin lifted. That was when she said her piece about her son and his baby boy and my best friend. Theo went still beside me. A passing aide slowed her steps, and I felt my own thumb find the thin gold watch on my wrist, the one that had belonged to my grandmother, and press against its face the way I'd done since I was a girl, waiting out something I couldn't change yet. I didn't raise my voice. I'd learned a long time ago that the loudest person in a room is rarely the one holding the truth. "Is that what you believe?" I asked her again, softer this time. Carol blinked, thrown by the calm. She'd expected tears, or rage, or at least a flinch. She got none of it. And somewhere down that hallway, a set of automatic doors hissed open, though I didn't turn to look yet. I didn't know who was coming, but I knew what I'd already set in motion. Here's the thing you should know about me before the rest of it makes sense. I grew up in a farm town in southern Ohio, the kind of place where everybody's business is everybody's gospel. My mother cleaned houses. My father drove a feed truck until his back gave out. I worked 2 jobs through college and another 2 through medical school, and I learned to keep my head down and let my work speak. That was the whole of my philosophy for most of my life. Do good work quietly, and the truth will sort itself out. People will see who you really are. I believe that the way some people believe in luck, it made me good in a trauma bay, where you don't get to panic and you don't get to explain yourself. You just fix what's in front of you and move to the next. The smell of the place, that clean cotton and antiseptic smell that clings to everything in a hospital, used to settle me the second I walked in. It meant I was somewhere I was good. Somewhere nobody had ever once called me broken. I could run a code, set a shoulder, talk a frightened kid through stitches, all without my pulse climbing. But that same instinct, the one that made me steady under pressure, had a shadow side. I carried things alone. I didn't ask for help. And when people started telling a story about me that wasn't true, I did the worst possible thing a quiet woman can do. I trusted that staying quiet would be enough. The hospital was the one place left where nobody dared call me hollow. The rest of my life by then was a different story. I married Mark Bishop when I was 28. He was charming in a way that made strangers feel chosen. He remembered names. He shook hands like he meant it. Half the county would have vouched for him, and for the first few years, so would I. We wanted children. We tried for a long time, and nothing happened. And the not happening sat in our house like a third person at the table. After about 2 years, I did what any doctor would do. I suggested we both get tested. Simple blood work, a basic workup. The kind of thing I ordered for patients all the time. Mark refused. He laughed it off at first, then got sharp about it. He said bishop men didn't have those problems. He wrapped it in a little speech about faith, about how we should leave it in God's hands. I pushed once. I pushed twice. And then I let it go. Because you cannot drag a grown man into a clinic, and because I still believed silence was a kind of patience. I went and got tested by myself. My results came back completely normal. I remember sitting in my car in the clinic lot, reading the paper, relieved and confused at the same time. If it wasn't me, then what was it? I didn't have an answer. I couldn't force one. And the longer I went without one, the easier it became for the people around me to write their own. By then, Mark had already started saying things, quiet things, to his mother first. That maybe the problem was me. That maybe I just couldn't. I didn't know yet how far a quiet lie can travel when the right person decides to carry it. Carol Bishop ran the women's circle at her church the way a general runs a campaign. She'd buried her husband young and raised Mark alone, and somewhere in those hard years she'd decided her son was proof she hadn't failed. He was perfect, because he had to be. If he wasn't, then what had all that sacrifice bought her? So when Mark whispered that the trouble was probably me, Carol didn't question it for a second. She picked it up, and she ran. It started small. A sympathetic sigh at a potluck, a hand on someone's arm, a lowered voice. Poor Mark. He wanted children so badly. Then it grew teeth. At a church supper that fall, she introduced me to a visiting pastor's wife with a look of practiced pity. "This is Myra," she said. "My daughter-in-law. She's a doctor, you know. Such a shame about the children." The woman gave me a sad, knowing nod, and I understood that whatever story had been told about me, it had already arrived ahead of me. I stood there in my good dress holding a paper plate, and Carol patted my hand like I was the one who needed comforting. Then she said the thing she'd go on saying for years, the thing she said the way other people say grace. Some women just aren't built for it. She smiled when she said it. She believed it. That was the worst part. She wasn't being cruel on purpose. She was repeating what her son had handed her, polished and certain, and she had no idea the words were a lie wearing her own voice. I drove home that night and didn't say anything to Mark. I should have, but I was still waiting for the truth to sort itself out. Paige Dolan had been my best friend since we were 15. We met in a high school chemistry class and stayed close through everything that came after. My move away for school, her string of jobs that never quite stuck, 2 states and a dozen years. She was the one I called when my father died. She stood up at my wedding in a green dress and cried during my vows. So when the church talk started getting to me, Paige was who I leaned on. She'd come over with wine and let me vent, and she always knew the right thing to say. Or so I thought. Looking back, every comfort she offered had a hook in it. "You're so accomplished, Myra. Maybe that's just not your path. Mark adores you. Don't let his mother get in your head. You don't need a baby to be whole." Kind words, all of them, but they always landed on the same bruise. They always reminded me of the thing I supposedly lacked. I didn't notice then how often her eyes drifted to Mark across a room, or how she'd started knowing things about his schedule that I hadn't told her. I was too busy being grateful to have one person who didn't seem to be judging me. She'd sit on my couch in my own living room and tell me I deserved better, and I'd nod, never once thinking she meant she deserved my life. People like Paige don't take what's yours all at once. They borrow it, piece by piece, until one day you look up and it's gone, and they're standing in it like they were always meant to. I trusted her completely. That was the second mistake I didn't know I was making. Mark filed for divorce on a Tuesday. I came home from a shift to find a manila envelope on the kitchen counter and his closet half empty. He didn't even wait to tell me himself. By the weekend, he'd moved into Paige's apartment across town, and the story had already been written for me. The version going around was tidy and cruel. Myra was cold. Myra was married to her job. Myra couldn't give him children, and a man wants a family, doesn't he? Carol made sure every pew heard it. Paige, my page, said nothing to correct it. The two people who'd known me longest let me become a cautionary tale, and I didn't fight it. Because fighting felt like proving them right. I didn't post a word online. I didn't call a single person to defend myself. I went to work the next morning and set a teenager's broken arm and told him he'd be fine, and he was. And that felt like the only true thing I did all week. If you've ever swallowed a lie about yourself just to keep the peace, to keep a family, a friendship, a reputation you'd spent years building, then you know exactly what that tastes like. It tastes like blood you're not allowed to spit out. Stay with me here, because this is where I started to understand something. The peace I was keeping so carefully wasn't even mine to keep. It belonged to the people lying about me. They were the ones who needed me quiet. Comment truth, if you've ever been there, and keep watching, because the silence didn't last. I want to tell you about the day a hospital board taught me that some things are worth getting loud about. The story stopped being about my marriage the day it walked into my hospital. I'd been in line for years to lead the emergency department. I'd built the trauma protocols half the county now ran on. The job was as good as mine, and everyone knew it. Then the whispers found the credentialing committee. Not the truth. There was no truth to find. Just the shape of it. Dr. Spencer's personal life is unstable. There are questions about her judgment. Did you hear about the divorce? About what her husband's family says? One board member, a man who golfed with Mark's uncle, started asking pointed questions about my fitness to lead under stress, as if I hadn't spent a decade staying calm while people bled out on my table. When the position was announced, it went to someone with half my hours and none of my protocols. They told me I was a strong candidate. They told me it was a difficult decision. They did not tell me the real reason, but I'd grown up in a small town. I knew the sound of a verdict dressed up as a compliment. That was the night something shifted in me. A lie about my body had cost me my marriage, and I'd let it, because I thought enduring it was the decent thing to do. But now the same lie was reaching into the one place I'd never let anyone touch. My work, my name, the thing I'd bled for. I sat in my car in the hospital lot, the same way I'd sat years before reading my normal test results, and I realized the silence I'd been so proud of had a price tag, and someone else had been quietly running up the bill. A nurse I trusted gave me the name of a lawyer named Ruth Calloway. Ruth's office was above a hardware store, and she had reading glasses pushed up into gray hair and a way of looking at you like she was already 3 moves ahead. I told her everything. The marriage, the church talk, the board, the job I'd lost. She listened without interrupting, which lawyers rarely do, and when I finished, she set down her pen. "What you're describing might be defamation," she said. "Maybe false light. But I won't lie to you. It's hard." She laid it out plainly. To win, we'd have to prove 3 things: that a specific false statement had been made, that it had been spread to other people, and that it had caused me real, measurable harm. "The harm part you've got," she said. "A lost promotion is a number. A salary is a number. That's the easy part." I sat there turning my grandmother's watch around my wrist. "And the false part?" Ruth looked at me over her glasses. "That's the part you have to be willing to fight about in public. They'll say the statement is true. They'll say you really couldn't have children. To win, you'd have to be ready to prove it wasn't you." I felt my stomach drop, because of course I couldn't prove that. My results were normal, but a normal result doesn't say whose fault the silence was. It only says it wasn't mine. I almost stood up and left. The whole thing felt like inviting the town to dissect me. Then Ruth said the thing I needed to hear. "Silence isn't a virtue, Myra, when it's costing you your career. Sometimes the kindest thing you can do for yourself is make them prove what they're saying." I didn't answer right away, but I didn't leave either. I spent 2 weeks weighing it. I'm not impulsive. I make decisions the way I read a chart. Slowly, then all at once. I wrote down everything I stood to lose. The church community that had watched me grow up. My standing in a town that already half believed the worst. The way people would talk, calling me bitter, calling me cold, saying I was the kind of woman who sues her ex-husband's family out of spite. I knew exactly how that story would go, because they'd already written most of it. But then I wrote down the other column. My name, my work, the truth, and the simple fact that I had done nothing wrong and was being punished for it anyway. I kept coming back to one thing. I wasn't doing this to hurt Mark. If I'd wanted to hurt him, I'd had a year of chances. I was doing this so that a hospital board would stop believing a story that wasn't true, so that the next time my name came up in a room I wasn't in, it came up clean. That was the line I drew, and I drew it on purpose. This wouldn't be revenge. Revenge is loud and hungry and never satisfied. This would be the truth, said once, in a place where it counted, by someone who'd finally decided she was done carrying a lie that belonged to other people. I called Ruth on a Monday morning before my shift. I told her I was in. Good, she said. Then let's make them say it under oath. I hung up and walked into the trauma bay and had the steadiest day I'd had in a year. Turns out a made-up mind is its own kind of calm. Ruth drafted the complaint over the next few weeks. It named the specific statements, the dates, the witnesses who'd heard them. It laid out the lost promotion, the salary difference, the documented harm to my professional reputation. Reading it was strange. My whole quiet humiliation, organized and numbered and turned into something with weight. When it was filed, the news moved through town faster than any ambulance I'd ever ridden. Myra Spencer is suing the bishops. Carol was incandescent. She told the women's circle I'd become vengeful and godless, that grief over my empty house had turned me cruel. She doubled down on every word she'd ever said, which, though she didn't know it, was exactly what Ruth had hoped she'd do. Mark stayed quiet at first. Paige did too. But I started getting messages. Some cruel, some curious, a few quietly supportive from women who'd had their own reputations rewritten by people who claimed to love them. One read, "Good for you." They did the same to my sister. I didn't respond to any of them. I just kept showing up to work and let the case move at the speed of the law, which is to say, slowly. Ruth told me the next step was the other side's response. How Mark's lawyer chose to defend the statements would shape everything. They've got two roads, she said. They can say the comments were just opinion, hurt feelings, nothing actionable. That road's annoying but survivable for them. She tapped her pen on the desk. Or they can plant their flag and say the statements were true. That you really were the reason. That road is the one I'm praying they take. I asked her why. She smiled like a woman who already knew the answer. Because then they have to prove it. And to prove it, they have to open a door. They took the second road. Of course they did. Mark's lawyer filed a response that planted the flag exactly where Ruth had hoped. Their defense, in plain English, was that the statements about me weren't defamation at all, because they were true. I really had been the reason the marriage produced no children. The fault, they argued on paper, was medical, and it was mine. When Ruth called to tell me, I could hear something close to delight under her steady voice. They just said the magic words, she told me. Truth is a defense. But here's what they didn't think through. She let it sit a beat. To prove the statement is true, to prove you were the infertile one, they'd have to put both of your medical pictures in front of a court. Now, I won't oversell it. Reproductive records are about as private as records get, and no judge hands them over lightly. We'd still have to convince the court it's relevant and narrow. But they just argued, under oath, that the cause was definitely you. They can't make that claim and then refuse to let anyone look at him. That's the crack. It's not a door swinging open. It's a crack. I can work with a crack. I sat down slowly at my kitchen table. Meaning? Meaning, Ruth said. They just put Mark's own fertility in play. He spent years hiding behind it was her. By swearing to it in court, he may have handed us the reason to finally ask about him. No promises. But it's the best opening we've had. For 6 years, I'd been the one whose body was up for discussion at potlucks and prayer circles, and in trying to make that official, in trying to win by saying it loud in court, the bishops had done the one thing none of them had ever been willing to do. They'd opened the door to looking at Mark. I thought about him refusing the tests all those years ago. The sharp, little speeches. The way the subject had always slammed shut whenever it turned toward him. I didn't say anything to Ruth yet. But a thread I'd buried a long time ago had just twitched, and I felt it move. That night, I couldn't sleep. So I did what I always do when something won't sit right. I went back through the timeline in my head, slow and careful, like reading an old chart for the thing you missed the first time. And there it was, 7 years back. A morning early in the marriage when Mark had driven up to the city alone for what he called a routine physical. He'd been gone all day. He came home different, quiet in a way that wasn't like him, short with me over nothing, and he'd poured himself a drink before dinner, which he never did on a weekday. I'd asked if everything was okay. He'd said the doctor was a quack, and the whole trip was a waste, and he changed the subject so hard it left a mark. And here was the part that kept me staring at the ceiling. After that day, he never mentioned getting tested again. Not once. Before the city, he'd at least pretended to take the question seriously. After it, the subject was simply closed, and somewhere in that same stretch of weeks, the first whispers about me began. I'd filed it away at the time as a man being moody about a wasted afternoon. I hadn't connected it to anything, because I hadn't been looking for a lie. You don't audit the people you love. But now, with Ruth's words still in my ears, that quiet day in the city looked less like a wasted trip and more like the moment something got decided. I didn't have proof. I want to be clear about that. I had a memory and a bad feeling, which is nothing in a courtroom. But it was enough to tell Ruth where to point. And the next morning, that's exactly what I did. Ruth listened to my story about the trip to the city without writing anything down, which I'd learned meant she was paying close attention. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. On its own, that's nothing, she said. A memory of a bad mood. But it's a reason to ask the right question. She explained what came next. Because the other side had put my fertility at issue, and because they'd argued the cause was definitely me and not him, Ruth could ask the court to compel the production of Mark's own relevant medical records. If he wants to claim it was you, she said, the law lets me ask to see whether it was him. That's how this works. You can't open a door halfway. She filed the motion the following week. Mark's lawyer fought it hard, and I understood then that I'd touched something real, because nobody fights that hard over nothing. They argued privacy. They argued relevance. They argued anything that might keep that one folder closed. The hearing got scheduled, and I had to sit with the not knowing, which for a person like me is its own special torture. I'm used to ordering a test and getting an answer. This was different. This was asking a judge for permission to even look. I went back to my shifts and set bones and read scans and tried not to think about a folder I'd never seen, sitting in some city clinic's archive that might say everything or might say nothing. Ruth told me to be patient. Courts move slow on purpose, she said. It gives the truth time to stop being scary. I wasn't scared of the truth. I'd never been scared of the truth. I was scared they'd find a way to keep me from it. Before the judge would rule on the motion, Ruth needed me to sign a verified complaint, a sworn version of everything, each statement, each date, each witness, attested to under penalty of perjury. She set it on the desk between us, a thick stack with little colored tabs marking every place my name went. Read all of it, she said, then sign only what you know is true. So I read it. Every line. The potluck. The pastor's wife. The exact words Carol said at the church supper. The ones about how some women just aren't built for it. The board meeting. The salary I lost. Reading my own quiet years laid out in numbered paragraphs did something to me. It made the lie look as flimsy as it actually was. I picked up the pen Ruth handed me, and I noticed the smell of the room. Not the clean antiseptic of my hospital, my old hiding place, but paper and ink, and dust from the hardware store below. For years, that hospital smell had meant safety, the one place no one called me hollow. Now here I was, somewhere else entirely, somewhere I'd had to walk out into the open to reach, and I wasn't hiding anymore. I pressed the pen to the line. The thin gold watch slid cool against my wrist as I wrote, and I thought of my grandmother, who used to say that patience isn't waiting, it's knowing the right moment when it comes. This was the moment. My signature went down clean and certain, the steadiest thing I'd signed in a year. When I lifted the pen, it was done. The complaint was verified. The motion was live. Whatever was in that folder in the city, the machine to find it was now running, and I was the one who'd started it. Ruth gathered the pages and squared them on the desk. "Now we wait for a judge," she said. I nodded. For the first time, the waiting didn't feel like helplessness. It felt like a fuse. The ruling came on a gray afternoon in the middle of a slow shift. Ruth called and I stepped into the supply closet to take it, surrounded by gauze and saline, my heart doing the thing it never did at work. "The judge granted it," she said. "With limits, but she granted it." She walked me through it carefully, the way she walked me through everything. Because the defense had affirmatively claimed the infertility was mine, the court found that Mark's own relevant fertility records had become, in the judge's words, presumptively discoverable. Not automatically public, not a free-for-all. The records would be produced under a protective order, reviewed first by the lawyers and the court, used only as the case required. "It's not a guarantee of anything," Ruth said, ever careful. "We don't know what's in the file. Maybe there's nothing, but they can't keep it shut anymore." I stood in that closet and let out a breath I felt like I'd been holding for 7 years. Across town, I later learned, the news landed very differently. Mark's lawyer reportedly asked for a private meeting the same day. Carol called Ruth's office twice and was told politely that the attorney couldn't speak with her. And for the first time, the people who'd spent years deciding what was true about my body went a little pale at the thought of a court deciding what was true about Mark's. I didn't celebrate. I want you to understand that. I didn't text anyone, didn't smile to myself in the mirror. I finished my shift, charted my patients, and drove back to my apartment alone. But that night I slept the whole way through for the first time in months, because I knew the folder was coming. And I knew that folders, unlike people, don't know how to lie. The first sign that something was wrong on their end didn't come from Mark or Carol. It came from Paige. She texted me out of nowhere after a year of silence. "Please don't do this. Think about the baby." I read it 3 times. We hadn't spoken since the divorce. She'd taken my husband and my life and never once reached out. And now suddenly she was begging me to stop a lawsuit that, on its face, had nothing to do with her. That was the part that snagged. The suit was between me and Mark and Carol. It was about words said about my body, about a job I lost. Why would Paige, who'd supposedly won everything, be frightened of it? Why would a woman holding the baby and the husband and the house be texting her ex-best friend at midnight, asking her not to dig? People who beg you to stop digging usually know what's in the ground. I'd learned that the hard way over the past year. I didn't answer her. I just sat with the question, turning it over, feeling the shape of something I couldn't see yet. Here's what I'd figured out by then, and what I want you to hear if you've ever been the calm one in a storm. The people most afraid of the truth are rarely the ones it's supposed to land on. I wasn't angry at Paige. I was curious. Bone deep, wide awake curious. If a quiet woman finding her spine is your kind of story, hit subscribe so the next part finds you, and tell me in the comments where you would have stopped. Because I almost did. Twice. But Paige's text didn't make me want to stop. It made me want to keep going. A frightened person had just told me, without meaning to, that there was more in the ground than I knew. The folder came 8 days later. I want to be precise about how, because it matters. I did not see it first. I couldn't have, and I wouldn't have. I'm a doctor, and there are records I have no right to touch, not my ex-husband's, not anyone's. That's the law, and it's a good one. The records went to Ruth, through the proper channel, under the protective order the judge had set. She read them with the other side's lawyer present, the way it's supposed to work. Then she called me and asked me to come to her office, which she'd never done before. I knew before I sat down. She had the careful face people get when they're about to hand you something heavy. 7 years ago, she said, Mark went to a clinic in the city, the one you remembered. She slid a single sheet toward me, just the line that mattered, the rest blacked out under the court's seal. The diagnosis was a word I'd written on charts 100 times. Azoospermia. No measurable sperm. Mark had been told, in plain clinical language, that he could not father a biological child. 7 years ago, the same week he came home moody and changed and quietly closed the subject forever. The same stretch of weeks the whispers about me began. I sat very still. Ruth watched me the way you watch a patient after you've told them the scan results. I didn't cry and I didn't shout. I just felt something enormous and quiet rearrange itself inside me, like a bone going back into joint. For 6 years I had been the broken one, the barren one, the shame of the Bishop family, and the man who'd let an entire town believe that had known, the whole time, that the empty house was his. I drove home with that single sheet of paper folded in my bag and I didn't turn on the radio. I expected to feel triumphant. I'd braced for that, even worried about it, because I didn't want to become a person who's happy about someone else's ruin. But triumph never came. What came instead was something stranger and sadder. Grief, almost. 6 years of my life had been spent absorbing a wound that was never mine. Every pitying look at church. Every "some women just aren't built for it." Every night I'd lain awake wondering what was wrong with me, what I'd failed to give, why my body had supposedly betrayed the marriage. All of it had been a story Mark wrote to cover a truth he couldn't face about himself. He'd handed his shame to me and let me wear it in public for years, and his mother had pinned it on with both hands. I sat in my car in the lot outside my apartment, the way I always seem to end up sitting in cars at the turning points of my life, and I said something out loud to nobody. The same thing I'd said to Carol in that hospital hallway. Is that what you believe? Only now I understood what I'd been asking all along. I'd asked it of a woman so certain I was broken. And the answer, the real answer, had been sitting in a sealed folder in a city an hour away the entire time. I wasn't broken. I never had been. The relief of that didn't arrive like fireworks. It arrived like a long exhale, like the first full breath after months of shallow ones. And underneath it, a new question was already rising, one I couldn't push back down. Here was the question, and I couldn't unask it once it formed. If Mark could not father a child 7 years ago, if the clinic was right, if the diagnosis held, then the baby boy Carol had bragged about in that hallway, the son Mark was parading through the maternity ward, the child he'd left me to go make with my best friend, could not be his. The arithmetic was brutal, if not quite simple. A man with that diagnosis almost never fathers a child the natural way. Not impossible in some rare cases, but vanishingly unlikely without treatment Mark had never sought. Which left a contradiction too big to ignore. Either the clinic had been catastrophically wrong, which happens but rarely, or the baby everyone in town believed was Mark Bishop's son had been fathered by someone else. I wasn't going to pretend I knew which. But I knew it was a question that needed a real answer, not a rumor. And suddenly, Paige's midnight text made a horrible, perfect sense. Please don't do this. Think about the baby. She wasn't worried about my lawsuit hurting Mark's feelings. She was worried about what a courtroom full of medical records might force into the open. Because Paige knew something the rest of the town didn't. She knew whose baby it actually was. I want to be careful here about what I did and didn't do, because it matters to me that I did this right. I did not go digging into the baby's records. I had no right to, and I wouldn't have. The child was innocent in all of this, and I have never once wished that child anything but well. What I had was a contradiction, sitting in plain sight, created entirely by the bishop's own defense. They'd sworn the infertility was mine. The records said it was Mark's. And a healthy baby boy across town said someone was lying about something much bigger than a marriage. I called Ruth. I think there's more in the ground, I told her. She didn't even pause. Then let's let the court find it, not us. The court. The man who'd walked into the hospital room that day, the one I told you about at the very start, had a name. Daniel Reyes. I didn't know him then. I learned about him the way I learned everything in this story. Slowly, properly, through the channels that don't lie. It turned out that during the months Paige and Mark were getting together, while Mark was still telling the world his wife was the broken one, Paige had been involved with someone else too. Daniel. A quiet man, by all accounts, who'd been led to believe the relationship was more than it was. When she chose Mark, Paige had cut Daniel off completely, blocked his number, never told him she was expecting, never breathed a word about a due date or a hospital. She'd gambled that he'd simply disappear, that he'd never connect the dots. But the timing hadn't sat right with him, and he'd kept asking quiet questions of the few people they'd both known. That very morning, one of them had let the hospital and the date slip. So he came. To see the child he suspected was his. And the moment he stepped through that door, the one person she'd been so sure would never find her. Paige's face drained of every drop of color. That's the picture I want you to hold. Carol, smug by the elevators, certain her son's perfect life had proven me worthless. And 5 steps behind her, walking into the maternity room, the living proof that the perfect life was built on the same kind of lie they'd buried me under for years. I didn't engineer that moment. I didn't even understand it when it happened. I just smiled at Carol and asked if that was really what she believed. And then a door opened and a stranger walked through it. And a whole house of lies started quietly coming down without my lifting a hand. Daniel, it would turn out, had questions a court could answer. And in a town where everyone had been so sure they knew the truth about my body, the truth about everyone else's was about to get its day. Mark knew. That's the thing I keep coming back to, the thing that turns this from sad to unforgivable. He'd known for 7 years that he couldn't father a child. So when Paige got pregnant, he knew, with absolute certainty, that the baby wasn't his. And he took it anyway. He stood up in front of his mother and his church and his whole small world and let them believe he'd made a son. The son his barren first wife had failed to give him. He used a child that wasn't his to complete the story that had destroyed me. Think about the nerve of that. The cruelty isn't even the affair, or the lie about my body, though those are bad enough. It's that he looked at a baby he knew couldn't be his and saw, first and foremost, a prop. Proof of his manhood. The final period at the end of the sentence he'd been writing about me for years. I tried, honestly, to find some sympathy for him. I'm not a hard person by nature, but every time I reached for it, I hit that same wall. He'd had 100 chances to tell the truth and quietly let me go. Instead, he'd built a monument to a lie and put a real child on top of it. When Ruth told me Mark's lawyer had gone quiet, no more motions, no more fight, just a request to discuss resolving the matter. I understood why. Mark wasn't afraid of losing the lawsuit anymore. He was afraid of what the lawsuit would say out loud, in front of everyone, about the son he'd been showing off. He'd spent 7 years controlling the story. And for the first time, the story was about to get away from him completely. Carol came to see me before the hearing. She showed up at my apartment on a Sunday, in her church clothes, and I almost didn't open the door. When I did, she looked older than I remembered. Smaller. She didn't apologize. I want to be honest about that, because for a moment I thought she might. She stood in my doorway and asked me, in a voice with a crack running through it, to drop the suit. Not for Mark, she said. For the family. For the baby. For the name. And as she spoke, I saw something I hadn't expected to see. I saw a woman who'd been lied to by her own son for 7 years, a widow who'd poured everything she had into one boy and built her whole self around the certainty that he was good. She hadn't spread those cruel words because she was evil. She'd spread them because Mark had handed them to her, polished and certain, and she had loved him too much to ever doubt him. For one breath, standing in my own doorway, I felt for her. She was human. She'd been used too. But then she said it again, the line she'd carried for years. except this time it came out as a plea instead of a pronouncement. Some women just aren't built for it, Myra. Why drag everyone through the mud over it? And I understood that even now, even standing on the edge of the truth, she'd rather protect the lie than let go of it. Sympathy is not the same as surrender. I could see her pain and still refused to carry her son's shame one more day. Carol, I said quietly, go home. The mud was never mine. She left without another word, and I closed the door, and I didn't feel cruel. I felt finished. Mark's lawyer offered a settlement, a quiet one. They'd pay a sum, issue a private retraction to the hospital board, make my professional record clean again, if I agreed to seal everything and never speak of it. Ruth laid the offer on her desk and watched me. It's a good deal, on paper, she said. You'd get your name back. The board would hear the truth. You could walk away with everything you came for. She wasn't wrong. It was, by the numbers, a win. Everything I'd said I wanted. My reputation, restored. The job, back in play. And all I had to do was let the truth get whispered in a back room and then locked in a drawer forever, while Carol kept saying her line at church and Mark kept showing off a son who wasn't his, and the story about the broken doctor stayed half alive in the corners of town where private retractions never reach. I thought about it for a long time. Then I told Ruth no, not out of spite. I want to be clear, because the difference matters. I didn't refuse because I wanted to watch Mark burn. I refused because a private truth was just a quieter version of the same lie. For 6 years they'd said it about me out loud, in churches and at potlucks, where everyone could hear. The correction had to live in the same place. Not a whisper. Not a sealed drawer. The truth, said once, where it counted, in front of the same people who'd believed the lie. I'm not going to whisper an apology for a wound he handed me, I told Ruth. I'll say it once, where it counts. And then, I'm done carrying it. Ruth capped her pen and smiled. Then we go to court, she said. Wear something you can breathe in. The hearing was held in the county courthouse on a bright, cold morning. I'd expected to be nervous. I'd run 1,000 codes without my hands shaking, but this felt different, because this time the thing on the table was me. The room filled in a way that told you everything about how small towns work. 2 members of the hospital board, there to see what they'd been wrong about. Several women from Carol's church circle, the same ones who'd nodded along to her pity for years. Carol herself, rigid in the second row. Mark beside his lawyer, pale and sweating in a suit that no longer fit him right. And Paige, near the back, holding herself very still, with a quiet man named Daniel sitting 2 rows behind her whose presence she could feel without turning around. I sat at Ruth's table and felt the whole architecture of the past 7 years gathered in one room. For 6 years these people had been the audience to my humiliation. They'd watched a woman get quietly branded and said nothing, or worse, repeated it. Now they were the audience to something else. That's the part I'd insisted on, the part Ruth understood. The lie had been public. The truth had to be public too, in front of the same eyes, or it would never really undo what had been done. I wasn't there to scream. I'd decided that weeks ago. I was there to let the truth stand up in the light and be counted, with witnesses, on the record, in the one kind of room where saying something false under oath has a cost. The judge took her seat. The room went quiet, and I felt my grandmother's watch, cool and certain against my wrist, ticking out the moment I'd waited 7 years for. Ruth didn't raise her voice once. That's what I remember most. She built it the way you build a diagnosis, one finding at a time, calm and unhurried, until the conclusion was the only one left standing. She established the statements, the dates, the witnesses. Carol's own words repeated at potlucks and prayer circles, that some women just aren't built for it. She established the harm, the lost promotion, the salary, the documented damage to my name. Then she addressed the defense's own claim, that the statements were true, that the infertility was mine. And she asked the court to consider the records the defense had forced into the case by making that very argument. Under the protective order, Only the necessary line was read. 7 years ago, Mark Bishop had been diagnosed at a city clinic with a condition that made fathering a biological child medically impossible. The room changed temperature. I watched the church women turn to look at Carol, who had gone the color of paper. Then Ruth, gentle as anything, laid the contradiction on the table, the one the bishops had built with their own hands. The defense had sworn the empty marriage was my fault. The record said it was Mark's. And there was, by the family's own loud account, a baby boy. She noted that the question of that child's paternity had become relevant to the support and custody matters now before a related court, and that genetic testing in that proceeding had not supported Mark's biological paternity. She said it plainly, without drama, the way you'd read a lab value. And that was when Mark stood up. "That's not... You can't..." His voice cracked across the courtroom. The judge told him to sit. Carol was on her feet too now, saying my name like an accusation, saying it couldn't be true, saying I'd twisted everything. The two of them, loud and unraveling, while I sat perfectly still at the table and said nothing at all. Carol turned on me then, the way drowning people grab at whatever's nearest. Her composure was gone, her church supper certainty cracked wide open, and out of the wreckage came the only words she had left. "Some women just aren't built for it," she cried, pointing a shaking finger across the room. "Some women just aren't..." She couldn't even finish it the second time, and I stood up, slowly, because I'd waited 7 years and I wasn't going to rush this. I didn't shout. I kept my voice flat and clear, the voice I use when I have to tell a family something true and hard, the kind of voice that's calmer than the room can stand. "You're right, Carol," I said. The whole courtroom went silent. "You're exactly right. One person in this marriage was never built to have children." I let that sit. I looked at Mark, then back at his mother. The file only ever had his name on it. Somewhere in the back of my mind, a hymn was playing, the one from my wedding, the one Carol had picked, the one that had floated through that church the day I married into all of this. It had meant one thing then. It meant the exact opposite now. Carol's hand dropped. Mark had his face in his hands, and the women from the church circle, the ones who'd nodded along to my ruin for years, sat there with the truth finally settling over them, rearranging everything they thought they'd known. I wasn't built wrong. I'd never been built wrong. The man who'd let an entire town believe otherwise was sitting 6 feet away, falling apart, while the calm woman he'd called broken stood steady on her own 2 feet. I'd said it once, out loud, where it counted. And I was already, finally, setting it down. What followed wasn't dramatic in the way you might imagine. There was no shouting match, no one dragged out. It was quieter than that, and somehow worse for the bishops because of it. Mark didn't deny it again. He couldn't. He sat with his head down while his own lawyer asked for a recess, and when the judge granted it, he didn't get up. He just stayed there, hunched in his ill-fitting suit, a man watching 7 years of careful storytelling collapse in a single morning. The church women gathered their coats and their purses and filed out with their eyes down, and I knew that by evening the real story would be moving through town as fast as the lie ever had. Carol followed them out, smaller than I'd ever seen her, no longer the general of any campaign. And Paige had slipped out during the recess, but not before Daniel rose from his seat 2 rows back and walked out the same door, close behind her. The question of that baby now headed somewhere. It could finally be answered honestly. I sat at the table and let it all empty out around me. Ruth put a hand on my shoulder. "You did that without raising your voice," she said. "I've been doing this 30 years. You'd be surprised how rare that is." The measurable things came in the weeks after, the way they do. Mark standing in town, the thing he'd protected at my expense for years, simply evaporated. You can't outrun a courthouse in a place that small. He left within a few months, moved 2 states over, somewhere nobody knew the story yet. He'd spent 7 years making sure everyone believed a lie about me. In the end, the truth didn't need me to chase him. It just needed to be said once, in the right room. The hospital board didn't make a show of it, which was fine by me. A few weeks after the hearing, the chair asked to see me. He was one of the two who'd sat in that courtroom, and he had the uncomfortable look of a man who'd believed the wrong thing and knew it. He told me the department leadership position was open again. He told me they'd reviewed the matter and found the earlier concerns about my judgment and stability to be without foundation. He didn't quite apologize, but he came close. And from a hospital board, close is about all you ever get. I took the job. Not because I needed to win one more thing, but because it had been mine, built with my own hands and my own years, and I wasn't going to let a lie keep it from me a day longer. My first week running the department, I walked into the trauma bay and breathed in that clean cotton and antiseptic smell, the one that used to mean safety because it was the only place no one called me hollow. It smelled different now. It smelled like a place I'd earned and gotten back, not a place I was hiding. I ran my first code as lead, with my hands as steady as they'd ever been, and afterward, standing at the sink washing up, I caught my own reflection in the dark window and didn't recognize the tiredness that used to live in my face. It was gone. I want to tell you I felt vindicated, and I did. But more than that, I felt light. Like I'd been carrying a bag of stones for 7 years without knowing the handle was right there, and someone had finally shown me I was allowed to put it down. People always want to know what happened to everyone after, so let me tell you, and then I'll let you go. Mark left, like I said. Last I heard, he was somewhere out west, starting over in a place that hadn't heard the story yet. I don't wish him harm. I don't wish him much of anything anymore, which is its own kind of freedom. Carol lost the thing she'd built her whole self around, not because I took it from her. I never said a word against her at that church, but because the truth about her son was simply too big to keep out of a town that size. The women's circle she'd ruled for 30 years quietly moved on without her. I heard she stopped going. I felt a small, real sadness about that. The sadness you feel for someone who chose the lie right up until it took everything. Paige and Daniel worked out the matter of the baby through the courts, the proper way, and I hope, for that child's sake, they found something steady on the other side of it. That little boy didn't ask for any of this. Paige and I never spoke again. Some friendships don't break. They just turn out never to have been what you thought, and you set them down with the rest. As for me, I kept the job, kept the apartment, kept the watch on my wrist. I didn't file anything more. I'd gotten what I came for. My name was clean, and the truth was standing up on its own, and that was enough. There was one more thing I did, and then I was done. I wrote Carol a short note, not a long one, not an angry one. I'd thought about her standing in my doorway in her church clothes, a woman who'd been lied to by her own son and chose the lie anyway, and I found I didn't want to carry any anger toward her into the rest of my life. Anger is just one more bag of stones, so I kept it simple. I won't carry your son's lie anymore, I wrote. You shouldn't either. That was all. I didn't expect a reply, and I didn't get one. But writing it closed something. I slid my grandmother's watch off my wrist that night and held it for a minute, thinking about what she used to say, that patience isn't waiting, it's knowing the right moment when it comes. I'd waited 7 years for the right moment. It had come, and I'd met it. And now the time that watch had been counting wasn't borrowed against some future reckoning anymore. It was just mine, the whole quiet rest of my life, finally, entirely mine. If you take one thing from my story, let it be this. The truth doesn't shout, and it doesn't chase. It just waits, patient as a watch, for the day someone finally stops being afraid and asks the right question out loud. That's my story. 6 years of a name that was never mine, and one quiet question that brought the whole thing down. If you've ever been told you were the broken one, let this be your sign to stop carrying it. Tell your truth where it counts, and then set it down. If this reached you, share it with someone who needs to hear it tonight. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.